George Floyd in Minneapolis back in 2020 sparked nationwide protests, including in Fargo. But this week, conservative commentator Ben Shapiro called for President Trump to pardon the man convicted in Floyd's death, former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin, to which Elon Musk responded, "Something to think about." For what it's worth, Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison is strongly against this idea.
I think that it is sadly another example of blatant disrespect for the law, blatant disrespect for George Floyd and his family and people who remember those very, very ugly days. I hope that Donald Trump has enough humanity to recognize that releasing Derek Chauvin would cause untold injury to George Floyd's family and the many, many people who feel vulnerable because they share experiences.
Ellison emphasized even if the president pardons Chauvin for his federal conviction, his state convictions for murder and other charges should remain. Floyd's younger brother, Terrence, said today he is not surprised by the pardon calls, but did say they are like reopening a wound.